I'm a little flustered because I'm so excited about our discussion here.
Hmm.
Not in a I love it way, but I'm shocked by this.
Right. And it'll be interesting to hash out how this came about.
So joining us now to talk about some shocking information about medical research is Dr. Stephen Grcevich. He's a child and adolescent psychiatrist and president and founder of Key Ministry. Welcome back, Dr. Grcevich.
Delighted to be at the only radio station in Cleveland that will have me.
Yeah, well, I like this kind of stuff. I think it's so important for us as followers of Christ to have a well-rounded view of life and learning and such. And so you serve a valuable purpose for our listeners. Now, before we get to the details of this study from the National Institutes of Health, I kind of want to have folks be reminded of science a little bit. I'm not a guy who hates science. There's people out there, I guess, that don't, or that hate it, but I don't. I love it. So remind us the fundamental principles of the scientific method. What is it?
Well, the scientific method is that one develops a hypothesis, or a theory as to something that might possibly be true. You set up an experiment to be able to test your hypothesis. You design that statistically to either affirm or refute your hypothesis with a certain degree, with whatever degree of certainty you determine statistically. And then when you get the results, you write them up, and those are critiqued and reviewed by peers before they're published, in a widely available peer-reviewed journal for other scientists to discuss and read and interpret.
Now, I notice you didn't use the words feelings or opinions in there.
No, facts are our friends.
And so, yeah, so if I'm a researcher, how I feel about it or what I want it to do really it's not even part of my thinking if I'm a researcher.
It shouldn't be.
It's really about, I've got an idea. Let's see if it's true or not. And I don't care whether it's true or not.
Well, that's one way that researchers and Christians have something in common. We should both be pursuing the truth.
So it sounds to me that in its pure form, you don't mind the scientific method as a Christian.
Oh, no, absolutely. Like, I've had people question before, like, how can you be a scientist and a Christian? And the reason for that is that science helps us to appreciate just, the wonder and the complexity of God's creation.
Yeah.
When you start studying, like, brains in kids, I mean, like, it's very, very hard to believe that this self-assembled out of some primordial soup.
Right. And now you actually, of course, with an advanced degree in being a child psychiatrist, you've done a lot of science. You participated in studies, and you teach students how to deal with research, right? Can you give us the basics of your experience in that?
Well, yeah, exactly. So for the last 8 years, I graduated from Northeast Ohio Medical University, like, many moons ago, like back when the Browns were actually good. But one of the things that they've developed over time, I've been part of, I guess, for about 8 years now, is that I help teach what's called the evidence-based medicine thread in the curriculum. Because if you're going to be a physician, it becomes critically important to be able to read through research, recognize studies that are pertinent to the types of like clinical problems and questions that your patients present with, be able to interpret the quality of that research. Is it subject to, to bias, to outside influence? Is it addressing the exact questions that are of concern to the patient sitting here in front of me? And essentially what we're helping them to do, and it's something that I wish I had more of, and I ended up having to develop it after getting involved or sort of stumbling into research as a clinician, is it helps physicians develop the capacity to critically think.
And we want you to do that, because if we have some sort of mysterious ailment,
absolutely,
we don't want your feelings about it to dictate what your diagnosis is. We want you to actually know how to do the research to figure it out.
Yeah, you want the guy who's going to go online if they don't have the answer to your problem and find the answer to your problem.
Yeah, exactly. And so with that in mind, we've had a really controversial thing happening the last number of years around the world, which is as gender becomes more fluid in our culture, we have doctors who want to prescribe a lot of puberty blockers to children struggling with gender dysphoria and gender identity. Now, before we get to the U.S. part of this, talk to us about kind of how things developed and then changed in Europe.
So one of the things that happened in Europe is that in a number of different countries, folks started becoming skeptical of the benefits of what's referred to here as gender-affirming care. There was an early study done in the Netherlands, I think it was probably around 2011, 2012, where, there had been folks who had hypothesized that that kids who were experiencing gender dysphoria might have those feelings intensify, like during puberty, as they started acquiring like secondary sexual characteristics. And so that there were docs there that hypothesized, well, if we gave them puberty blockers and delayed the onset of puberty, would this help to attenuate some of their emotional distress? And so that there was a small study that was done that reported out on some potential mental health benefits. There were some interesting issues with that study in that compared to kids who are getting treatment for this now, that this group of kids was remarkably mentally healthy and probably not necessarily like representative of.
So it wasn't a good sample.
Well, yeah, it was sort of a cherry pick sample.
Gotcha.
So that the kids who took part in that particular study were kids who didn't have some of the psychiatric comorbidities, the other concomitant psychiatric conditions that would lead one to have a negative response. So that on the basis of this study in the Netherlands, this whole sort of approach to gender-affirming care came about. Now, other folks have tried to replicate the findings of that study,
which is what good science does.
Which is what we do. So the highest level evidence, like when we're looking at like 1A, level of evidence, are meta-analyses, which are basically studies of, in which they analyze multiple controlled studies to try to get to the truth.
Yeah, because what science wants to do, right, is take the initial study and go, is this a good study? So let's replicate it.
Exactly.
And see if we get the same results.
Yeah, and what's happened over time is that there were some other folks in Europe who weren't able to replicate those results, or what they were seeing in clinical practice in Europe wasn't fulfilling what had been the expectation of the gender affirming care. And that there had been reporting, like one of the other things that's different in Europe is that, because all these countries have socialized medicine, all of their information's in a single database. And you can on sort of like a nationwide basis start looking at like clinical outcomes with some of these kids. So that in particular, the one that's gotten the most media attention is that, in the UK, they have the British Health Service. Everybody has, government-funded health care. And all of the kids who were experiencing gender dysphoria were treated at one clinic in London. And there were a lot of concerns coming out about things that were going on at that clinic in London. Like why were there 11 times more kids being treated in 2017 or 2018 than what you were looking at in like 2008 or 2010? One of the issues that came out when they started investigating that clinic was that kids with autism were 17 times more likely to get puberty blockers for gender dysphoria than kids in the general population. Were they misdiagnosing or failing to understand that maybe kids with autism perceive gender differently? But this all culminated in the British Health Service commissioning Hilary Cass, who's like a highly regarded pediatrician, to do an independent review of the research literature on gender. And they did basically 6 meta-analyses where these are larger studies where they're studies of studies, where they found that the evidence didn't support doing any of this stuff. And as a result,
so they shut it down.
They shut it down. And
that's how it's supposed to work, right, Steve?
Exactly.
This and for those of us who remember basic science in high school, right? Mm-hmm. That's how it's supposed to work. You don't care what the outcome is, But when you look at the evidence and the evidence says, wait, this isn't working, we should stop this, the scientific method has worked.
Yes.
Now, we have to take a quick break and we come back. Apparently in America, we've forgotten how the scientific method works. If you're just tuning in, our guest is Dr. Steve Grcevich, a longtime contributor to the show, child and adolescent psychiatrist here in Northeast Ohio, and president and founder of Key Ministry. We're talking about gender struggles in kids and the rampant use of puberty blockers among physicians. And he took us through not just the scientific method and how it really is something Christians can applaud when it's done properly. And then how Europe actually played that out for us. And they've shut down clinics that are passing out puberty blockers because of the danger this poses to kids. Enter the New York Times and their description of the American research now. Can you give us the story on this?
So beginning about 10 years ago, the federal government started funding a series of studies to look at the potential benefits of, again, what's referred to as gender-affirming care in kids. And so this particular doc, Johanna Olson Kennedy, is at Children's Hospital in Los Angeles. Got $10 million from the federal government to do a study.
It's a big grant.
It's a chunk of change, and these are highly competitive grants, to do a study looking at the mental health benefits in kids of using puberty blockers, as part of a gender-affirming treatment approach. And so this study began in 2015. They followed kids out over time. There were 95 kids involved in the study. And lo and behold, they didn't see any mental health benefits associated with using puberty blockers in kids with gender dysphoria. But that was a problem for Dr. Kennedy or Dr. Olson Kennedy, because one of the things that she's been very actively involved with is a champion of gender-affirming care.
While doing the research.
While doing the research. But it's not unusual for someone who would have that background to be considered a quote-unquote expert.
Okay.
And to be speaking into issues that come up when you're looking at government policy. So she'd been traveling around the country trying to, encourage states, to adopt legislation in support of a gender-affirming approach. But she did this study, that didn't produce the results that she was looking for, in support of that type of advocacy. And despite having had it funded with $10 million in taxpayer money, chose not to publish it because she was concerned about the political impact of that study on, state legislatures and their determination as to whether or not that they should allow these gender clinics for kids to operate.
So if I'm understanding this right, you have a physician, a researcher, gets $10 million in federal money to do research on the impact of puberty blockers on kids.
On mental health of kids with gender dysphoria.
She wants there to be positive results.
Yeah, absolutely.
Discovers in the research that there isn't any.
That's right.
And then refuses to publish the results.
That's right.
That's scandalous, Steve.
Well, it's interesting because as a result of some other research that was done in kids about 20 years ago, where people raised very serious ethical concerns, basically all of the rules about how one goes about reporting and publishing research changed. So again, this was 20 years ago. GlaxoSmithKline made an antidepressant called Paxil, and they were trying to get it FDA approved for teens with depression. They did 9 studies. 8 of them were negative. They hid the results of those studies and chose not to publish them because they didn't support use of the drug. And so that as a result of that, that there was legislation that was passed so that, that there were journal editors who got together and determined that, that when you're doing a research study, there has to be a database. It's called clinicaltrials.gov. So that if you want to publish a research study in a peer-reviewed journal, you have to post in advance on that site, the nature of your study, what you're looking to study, what your primary and secondary outcome measures are, and a link to your data when it's published. So, if it's unethical for a drug company to refuse to publish the results of negative studies in kids, and if we've all decided that it's critically important to publish negative studies so that people don't expose patients to treatments that are, ineffective or potentially dangerous, how is it okay for somebody whose research was funded by the federal government to choose not to publish it because it doesn't support their preferred agenda?
But according to National Institutes of Health Policy, as I learned in an article you sent me, this is allowed. It's unethical, I think, but it's allowed, right? You don't have to publish the results.
Okay, so one of the things that changed as a result of this whole scandal is that a lot of time, like if you look at like medical journals, like it's hard to get access to an article or to read something if you don't have a subscription to that journal.
Right.
And I mean, like med school libraries may subscribe to like hundreds of things, but the typical doc might subscribe to like 2 to 5 different journals. And so that one of the things that was made law is that if you do a study with with federal funding, the entire paper or the report of that study is made available on a website called PubMed, National Library of Medicine. So that anybody can read a paper that's published with federal funding, but the rules as they exist now give authors and people who are doing funded research discretion as to whether they will choose to publish those findings. So once published, they're publicly available and there's no paywall and anybody can access them through the National Library of Medicine. But like legally, they can't charge this doc with anything for refusing to publish it. But here's the larger issue that I've noticed come into play. And I actually got an email from one of our listeners over the weekend that plays into this, that there's been a precipitous drop in the last 5 years in the trust that American people have in medicine and in physicians. And one of the things that's becoming a big concern for Christian parents, in large part because of some of these issues around gender, is can I trust, can I trust like the mental health professionals who work at the children's hospital or who are covered by my health plan to take care of my kids? And this mom was concerned because their daughter had gender dysphoria, and she was reaching out to me as a listener of this show, like, we could find her a counselor, but what child psychiatrist can I take her to? And there wasn't anybody who openly takes patients that I felt confident referring her to. I was talking to another psychologist, this was a few weeks ago, who, I'm on the Physicians Resource Council for Focus on the Family. Focus on the Family has sort of a national referral list of like Christian mental health professionals. And this guy works with kids, and he was telling me he is getting inundated with new referrals from Focus on the Family because Christian parents are becoming very concerned about, the objectivity of mental health professionals, the kind of folks who are working with kids, and whether or not those professionals will, attempt to, to undermine some of the values and, the biblical worldview and perspective that parents are trying to communicate. So, so part of why this is, in addition to the fact that from a scientific standpoint, if we're pursuing truth, that choosing not to publish this is unethical.
Oh, it's outrageous.
It has an extraordinarily negative impact on sort of public trust in our profession insofar as it comes to caring for vulnerable kids.
Yeah, and I would say that I want to try to be hopeful. And I would be hopeful that this doctor's decision to not publish, the scandalous decision not to publish, will be a wake-up call to, I don't care what your background is, to people who value the scientific method in medicine. And there's got to be a lot of them left. I
hope so.
I hope that there is. If it happened in Europe right? That people go, wait a minute, this is not working. Whether I like it or not doesn't matter. It's not working. This hurts kids. If Europe can do it, can't we?
Well, you would hope so, but this stuff I think is wrapped up in politics here in a way that it's not in Europe.
Wow. Lord help us. Goodness sakes. Yeah, there's not a lot to say because it's so scandalous, but I can tell you that here's one thing I'm hopeful at. Like journalism at its core, when done right, is not that different from the scientific method. It's really about investigating, finding facts, and reporting them, whether or not you like them.
That's right.
Now, we can't prevent bias anywhere. Bias exists because people exist. But the New York Times was certainly not kind to this physician for her decision. They raked her over the coals for this, it seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, they advocate for a lot of things that I don't agree with, but I have to give them credit for their integrity in terms of reporting on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, if I were this doctor reading this article, I'd be sweating because they did not do her any sort of favors. They made it very clear that she's got ethical problems not releasing the data. And I get wound up about this, and one of the reasons I get wound up is because it hurts kids.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing to hurt adults, but kids?
No, we shouldn't be hurting adults
We shouldn't be hurting them either. But like, if you want to get me wound up, it's this rampant abuse of children in the name of medicine that the scientific method disproves its value. Europe has figured it out. Now we have a physician in America that got $10 million of taxpayer money and refuses to release the data and thinks we're so dumb we won't know why they won't release it. You know, it's scandalous, Steve. And I pray that it'll be a wake-up call for people who love truth, whether or not they acknowledge yet that Jesus is truth, that they value truth enough to make some changes here like Europe did.
Yeah, and so even though I'm retiring from clinical practice in June, one of the things that I'm looking for is some opportunity to continue to like teach or maybe mentor younger physicians, because I think that whatever the end of my medical career looks like, the theme of that is, you know, the importance of speaking up for the truth.
Yeah, amen. Amen. And time flies when you're hanging out with Steve Grcevich. He is a child and adolescent psychiatrist here in Northeast Ohio, and he's president and founder of Key Ministry. Key Ministry can help you and your church better serve the needs of those with special needs among us. Whether or not it's mental health or physical disabilities or developmental disabilities, they can help. So if you want more information about connecting with Dr. G or with Key Ministry, I'm assuming it's keyministry.org.
Keyministry.org. And, you know, for save the date, April 29th to May 1st at David Platt's Church, McLean Bible Church in Washington, D.C., we host the largest disability ministry conference in the United States. And so I am going to begin this weekend looking through all of the proposals that we have from speakers for that.
Exciting.